When we accept God's challenge to us to take this 7-year journey pursuing an ecological economics, we are not just following God's law from Leviticus, we are actually following God's example. Genesis 1 gives us an example of what God looks like as an entrepreneur creating systems in which all creatures depend on each other, and in doing so have the chance to flourish, to multiply, to be fruitful, and to be enough. Perhaps you feel like you know this story, Genesis 1, God creating the sun, moon, and stars, God creating the sky, God creating all the fish and animals, God creating human beings. But I want to notice 3 things about this story that maybe you haven't noticed before that help us to understand what it might mean for God to be our example, for us to be in the image of God as God embarks on creating an ecological economics. And the first thing I want to notice is that God doesn't create everything in this passage. There's one exception. On day 3, God partners with the land in order to achieve the creation of all of the growing things that we have filling this earth. So if we look at verse 11 of Genesis 1, then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kind. And God saw that it was good. Maybe that sounds like a small semantic detail, but in all of the other days, when God says, "Let there be something," we're then either told just that it is, or we're told that God then rolls up God's sleeves and gets to making the thing that God imagined. But on day 3, when God imagines plants of every kind and seed-bearing things and fruit to eat, the land is who actually produces those things according to God's vision. When God engages in an ecological economics, when God sets the foundation for how needs are to be met in this world, God engages in creative partnership with others. God is not the only player on the field. It's kind of funny because on day 6, God follows this model again. God tries to partner with the land again, verse 24. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And then you almost expect the same language from the last time that God imagined the land producing, that God invited the land into creative partnership. Except the language changes, and we're told instead that God made the wild animals, the livestock, all the creatures that move along the ground. You can almost imagine the land in the background saying, "I liked that first partnership, but actually I'm not in the business of producing animals. If you want animals, you're going to have to find someone else to produce that or do it yourself." So God engages in these creative partnerships that are responsive, and in which the creative partner, the land, seems to have some autonomy to produce what the land is willing to produce, and to create boundaries and not produce what the land is not willing to produce. The other thing that I notice about Genesis 1 as I try to read it anew with God, this entrepreneur creating economical and ecological systems, is I notice that in God's ecological economics, creatures meet each other's needs. So after having created all of these creatures that will fill the earth, God turns to the issue of how these creatures are going to be sustained in an ongoing fashion. It's not enough to create the systems. It's important to think about how the systems can sustain everyone, all creatures included in them. And so in verse 29, God turns God's eyes to this sustenance matter of systems, of economy. And God says, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, every tree that has fruit with seed in it, and they will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. The thing that I want to notice about that is that God doesn't leave creative partnership behind when God turns to systems that will be ongoing, that will provide continuing sustenance. Did you notice that God gives all of the creatures God made with God's hands in order to sustain them? God doesn't give something God made. God gives the one thing that the land produced. God gives everything with seed-bearing fruits and plants and trees in it to humans and animals for sustenance. That creative partnership threads all the way through, both from the creation of economies that work for all and into the sustenance of those in ways that work for all. But the third thing that I want to notice is that God's economy does not stop with sustenance. We are called to thrive and not simply to survive. One of the things I love about Genesis 1 is that it's full of language about God blessing us, God seeing that things are good and naming them good. And I want us to dig in really quickly to that blessing that we are given as human beings, because I think it's one of the places in this passage where we can get into trouble and where we can fall off track with following God's pattern for an ecological economics. So when God turns to bless human beings in verse 28, God says to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it." Be fruitful and increase in number. This is a translation of the Hebrew phrase, paru uravu. And when we hear it as be fruitful and increase in number, I think we can begin to think about blessing as something that makes us bigger and bigger, something that expands our household, something that is about growth. But blessing as about growth is only one translation of this Hebrew phrase. This phrase, paru uravu, can also be translated be fruity or be like fruit and be enough. Be fruity or be like fruit and be enough. If we take that to be God's primary blessing to us, how might we differently imagine what it looks like not just to survive, but to thrive in God's economy? The other thing I want us to notice about this blessing that's given to humans is that this is the second time that blessing, paru uravu, has been given in the text. The blessing that we're given was actually first given to animals, right? God saw these winged birds in verse 22, and God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." So this blessing that we get, whether we want to think of it as being fruitful and multiplying, or whether we want to think of it as being like fruit and being enough, this blessing that we are given was first given to animals. And our ability to live into this blessing is always going to have to live alongside the same blessing that was given to God's other creatures. If we think of this blessing as ever growing, be fruitful and multiply, we can see how the blessings of some creatures might begin to butt up against the blessing of others. But if we translate this Hebrew phrase, be like fruit and be enough, I hear us being invited into a kind of creativity, a kind of sweetness, being invited to be sustenance for other creatures around us, and to stand steady, to be enough in who we are and what we have now. Be fruitful and be enough. Genesis 1 tells us that we were made in the image of God, that we were made to look like this entrepreneurial creator. So as you attempt in your life, in your business, in your practices, to put Laudato Si into practice over the next 7 years, know that you're not just following principles. You're not just following God's rules. You are becoming the very image of your Creator. So may it be.